Thanks for joining me for another episode of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement. I am here at the News Forum where all voices matter. Well, as the supply chain crisis continues in 2022, companies are trying to figure out how to build in continuity and redundancy. This is where the need for consistent supply chains intersects with getting the best available data and analysis. Our guests recently announced a collaboration to create a resiliency platform, and they join us here today. Welcome to the program, the Honorable David MacNaughton. He is president of Palantir Technologies Canada, and as a returning guest, Bryan Smith, co-founder and CEO of ThinkData Works. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thanks, good to be here.
Thanks for having us.
For sure, Bryan, and let's start with you. Obviously, before we get to the solution that you're proposing, love to get your analysis of what is the problem we're trying to solve with this.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think when we talk about supply chain, we aren't necessarily just talking about getting a product on a shelf. We're really talking about the effort it takes manufacturers to navigate their networks of suppliers that provide them the parts required to build consumer products in the first place. So if we think about the empty shelves at a grocery store, it's pretty easy for the average person to visualize how hard that could be to keep things stocked as we're battling through a pandemic. But really imagine a manufacturer building cars with a complex global supply chain that requires just-in-time shipping for over 30,000 parts per vehicles. That's flying, sailing, and driving in from all over the world. A delay in something as simple as a piece of tubing because of a regional block in, say, Japan, has the potential to completely shut down a production line for a day. And that's a really, really serious problem. So that's what we're looking at when we're talking about supply chain and how we can help with our technology.
Dave MacNaughton, this isn't a theoretical thing. We're kind of living through a supply chain crisis right now. The headlines are very clear, and as Bryan said, you just have to go sometimes to your local grocery store to see that things are rather amiss. Let's put it that way. So I guess my question to you is, do you see this as a recurring challenge? Is this kind of the new normal that we have to navigate together?
Well, I think it's going to last for a while. I mean, I don't think that there's any sort of silver bullet here that's going to solve the problem because it's got, a multiplicity of causes. Some of them are COVID related. Some of them are, as Bryan mentioned, most companies have gone to this whole just-in-time supply thing, which means, you don't have a lot of inventory in stock. So if something goes wrong, you're in big trouble. You can't manufacture up to what your sales are. There's also, we've seen a significant shift in e-commerce, up 20% in 2020 over 2019. So all of these things together have really, caused a huge problem in terms of, a whole series of industries from agriculture all the way through to advanced manufacturing. And it's going to take a while for companies and countries to get out of this. And we're not even talking yet about political uncertainty, climate, things that are impacting shipping. There's just a whole multiplicity of things that are going on right now. And of course, what our view is on this is that the way to at least begin to address it is to try to have all of the information possible, all of the data that will allow companies and people to make informed decisions. And that's where our software platform can ingest an awful lot of data in real time that will allow people to make decisions about their supply chain.
We're going to go to a break, but before we do, a quick question for you, David. So I want to make sure I understand your hypothesis, and it is namely that this was accelerated by the COVID situation and by some other immediate trends, but this is kind of almost like a long time coming.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you've had a real coincidence of a number of factors, and probably just pushed really to the nth degree by the COVID situation.
We're going to continue with our guests in a moment. Bryan, we'll get to you. Don't worry. We've got 3 more segments to go, but we are going to take a brief commercial break. Please stay with us. We'll be right back after those breaks. Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here at the News Forum, here with the Honorable David MacNaughton. He is president of Palantir Technologies Canada, and also Bryan Smith. He is the co-founder and CEO of ThinkData Works, talking supply chains today. Bryan, I guess this is the point in the show where you get to demonstrate or talk a little bit about what you're proposing. So tell us a little bit about your platform and how it's going to help solve the problems.
Yeah, absolutely. So at a high level, ThinkData Works and Palantir Technologies have partnered with Martin Rea International to develop an industry-wide platform for supply chain resiliency that really we want to help manufacturers predict, prevent, and mitigate disruptions to their supply chain. So through this solution, which is partially funded by the federal government through the Advanced Manufacturing Supercluster, we can take a manufacturer's entire global supply chain and generate its digital twin within our software. From there, what we can do is we can connect to real-world data from around the world. So think things like weather, political news, accidents, events, all these types of things, and stream that information into the platform in order to generate what we call signals that we believe a company should make actions upon. So with this digital twin that we can create, we can really start opening up opportunities for organizations to mix it with real-world data and start doing things like simulate supply chain disruptions and create backup plans. We could analyze their parts universe and understand how to optimize it, or we could sort of, set up alerts for things like unrest in Eastern Europe and immediately identify all of the parts in the supply chain that may be affected, depending on which way that direction goes. So it's really a game changer for a lot of manufacturers, but it's giving them the insight that they otherwise wouldn't have by just kind of sitting and operating in a reactionary effect like we've seen in the past. It's kind of opening them up to the idea of simulating, predicting, and getting ahead of curves rather than kind of waiting and responding.
Yeah, very interesting. I'd just like to pursue this for a second because the way you describe that, it's a sort of a combination of what is the cost of the freight on the container ship kind of information. That's a hard cost. You know what that cost is going to be. With kind of like almost like a subjective analysis of risk associated with political disturbances or some other things that are not as easily quantifiable. So how would you create a quantifiable number that would be helpful for business?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think cost avoidance is a thing that we're working with a lot of manufacturers on. What does it cost to actually shut down a manufacturing line for a minute, an hour, a day? The numbers are pretty astronomical if you start looking at it. And if you look at something like a car, which I think on average has about 30,000 parts coming in from all over the world, anything can affect this. And the downtime associated with having to shut something like a line down for an hour, even a minute, is in the millions, tens of millions of dollars. Working with Martin Rea and our partners at NGen to kind of understand what manufacturers are up against, we're predicting around 40 million annually in cost avoidance and savings through the implementation of the platform. And that's on a manufacturer by manufacturer basis. So if we put that into perspective, we could see some pretty massive savings and something that we want to kind of arm Canadian manufacturers with so that we can kind of punch above our weight in the global economy.
We've got about a minute and a half before the next break. David, I want to ask you a couple of things, but before we get to that, Bryan, I know that you have done a lot. We've had you on the program before about how data is changing the abilities of companies to react and plan. So this is kind of like an additional suite of services that you think are important for companies to use data in real time to do better, right?
Yeah, I think the amazing thing that Palantir brings to the table is the ability to create that digital twin as an asset for an organization. So imagine taking your entire business and all its operations and creating a virtual version of it, and then being able to simulate out what business decisions, what effects could happen, and how that affects your business. And then I think what ThinkData Works does really well is we take all of those real world signals and throw it at that problem as well and say like, hey, not only is it a business decision to go into a different country, but what if there's political unrest in that country and we shut down our borders? What does that affect this decision, and how does it affect the business moving forward? And it's a game changer at the end of the day.
We're going to continue our discussion with the Honorable David MacNaughton. He is the president of Palantir Technologies Canada, and with Bryan Smith, he is the CEO of ThinkData Works, talking about supply chain resiliency. We'll be back after these messages. Please stay with us. And we're back here at Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement. Here at the News Forum, we have the Honorable David MacNaughton. He is president of Palantir Technologies Canada, and also Bryan Smith. He is the co-founder and CEO of ThinkData Works. David, I guess I'd love to know how far your vision extends. What do you see as the next steps for this platform, and are you going to be making it widely available? Those kinds of questions.
Well, we think we've got something, in our software that is extraordinarily powerful in the sense that it can ingest an awful lot of data and allow companies to make better decisions. And what Bryan and ThinkData Works have brought is, when a company can decide which kind of data they want that is going to affect their business most, and Bryan and his ThinkData Works people have been able to pull all that together in an accurate way and everything else. And so as Bryan said, I think we're going to be able to show fairly quickly the kind of cost avoidance, cost savings in the company that we're working with and the companies that we're going to be working with. I think this is something that this is going to not just help Canadian manufacturers, but we hope to, or we are going to be doing this around the world. And I think that the challenges that companies all over are facing, I think we can help address them. I mean, our software has allowed companies in as diverse industries as oil and gas to airplane manufacturer to enhance their production in the most efficient way, and to increase their production. So this is the way of the future, and it's pretty interesting, I think, for Canadians to, as Bryan said, we're in a really tough economic situation at the present moment globally. And it's no time to sit back and not use the tools that are available to make sure that you are among the most competitive companies in the world. And I think what we are showing is that we can do that. We can help companies become that much more competitive. They decide what kind of data they need to ingest. Our software can ingest just millions of bits of it and make sense of it. So we're pretty excited about this. I think it's as Bryan says, a real game changer.
One interesting thing that just sort of cropped in my mind, David, is could this eventually also factor in environmental, social, and governance goals of a company? Let's say, part of the political risk of manufacturing something that has a supply chain into Xinjiang, for instance, is, well, you're dealing with the Uyghur genocide issue, and maybe your shareholders are concerned about that, as indeed your employees might be. So that's, and then of course the environmental goals are obvious. We want to reduce the environmental footprint of the supply chain. So is that something you're looking at as well, David?
Yeah, what we're in a position to do is to, as I said, ingest whatever data, whatever inputs somebody decides that they want to measure. We can do it. We don't decide which are the ones that are most important for a company or are going to affect whether it be their production costs or, as you say, their ESG. But I think increasingly those kinds of issues are going to factor into companies' production decisions, because there will be, it's already being discussed in Europe about having what is, really import duties dependent on the carbon content of the production of the components that go into production. So it's going to become more and more complex as time goes on, and companies are going to want to, and in some cases are going to be forced to look at different kinds of measurements of, what it used to be pretty simple. It was, what's the cheapest source of material that has a reasonable quality? And now it's way more complex than that.
Bryan, we've got about a half a minute before the break. Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think to David's point, ESG is a natural progression of where we're at with our current supply chain product. Supply chain is one of the largest components if we're looking at a carbon footprint of a particular product, especially when we're stitching together hundreds, if not thousands, of products from all over the place.
Bryan, I'm sorry. I am now less beholden to the Canadian people and more beholden to our sponsors. So hold that thought. We're going to come right back to it after the break. And welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm here with Doctor. Well, I can call you Doctor. You've almost got that nomenclature, but he is the Honorable David MacNaughton. He is president of Palantir Technologies Canada, and Bryan Smith, co-founder and CEO of ThinkData Works. David, I'm taking a bit of a liberty here. I know you're very, obviously, your focus is Palantir, but you also were Canada's ambassador to the United States, and you've got that analytical framework for the work you're doing at Palantir. So obviously this project is at least indirectly, if not directly, funded by government. So what are your expectations of how government can also help in the supply chain crisis?
Well, I think there are a couple of ways. One of them is to try to impress on the United States, for one, that significant disruptions in the supply chain between Canada and the United States will increase costs on both sides of the border. And at a time when people are increasingly concerned about inflation, that isn't a very good thing to do. I mean, I remember when we were doing the NAFTA negotiations, one of the things that I hadn't realized was how much products go back and forth across the border before they get assembled. And that's particularly the case in the automotive industry, where the typical part goes back and forth 7 times before it ultimately gets sort of assembled in the automobile. So in part, what the government is helping Canadian manufacturers to do is to understand the complexity of the supply chain and make some decisions using data to improve the resilience of their supply chain. But they can also, I think, help make sure that countries who are major trading partners don't institute policies that may, in the short term, look as if they're politically good, but in the long term will actually cause real problems. And I think it's something you can't rest on your laurels about. We've got a free trade deal with Canada, with the U.S. and Mexico, but we've already seen certain initiatives that the U.S. is proposing to do, which would cause real problems in terms of the automotive sector.
Yeah, absolutely. David, I just, again, want to return to this from another angle. Of course, President Biden, quite apart from the issue about the electric vehicles and that kind of thing, he has done several executive orders to reimagine the U.S. supply chain for PPE supplies, for semiconductors, for critical minerals and rare earth elements, et cetera. So is this a thing, maybe putting on both of your hats simultaneously, could your platform help build the case that Canada should be still included in that supply chain network?
Well, when you look at something like critical minerals and rare earths, for sure. I mean, because what's happening right now is we're getting a lot of that from countries like China, where you don't really want to be that dependent on them. And we saw in the PPE example where the Trump administration initially said, well, we're not going to export any of those PPEs, and then the reality is that there was pulp coming from Nanaimo that was going into the face masks that the Americans were using. And so you kind of, once you understand the interdependency, then you're less likely to do things that, as I say, in the short term seem to be sort of popular or populist or whatever, but even in the short term can hurt. So I think the more people understand the interrelationship, the better off everybody's going to be.
Last, gentlemen, we are out of time. We could talk for another hour, I'm sure, but your time is precious as well. I just want to thank our guests, the Honorable David MacNaughton and Bryan Smith, for their insights today. Thanks for being on the program.
Thanks, Tony.
Thanks so much.
Well, again, things are changing. Supply chain shortages are creating a new dynamic, and people who are aware of the power of data are getting into the mix, helping our manufacturers to get their supply chains worked out. So very interesting guest today. I'm glad they were with us. I'm glad you were with us. We'll see you soon.